Hello and welcome to Gardening in 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you guys an update on my Davallia Fern here. So it's been almost 2 years actually since I've had this fern, and about 2 years since I've last done an update, and it's growing really quite well. It's not the fastest growing of plants. Most ferns tend to be a little bit slower than most house plants, but as you can see it has got to a decent size. I'll now show you a photo of what it looked like on the previous update, and you'll see how much it's grown in those 2 years. So as you can see, in the previous update it was basically just a plant that was planted in the top of this lava rock, and it just had leaves towards the top. But what's happened since then is the rhizomes have spread down, and you can see that some of them are actually escaping the pot now. These rhizomes, what they do is they creep along the ground and then they produce these leaves that come out of the rhizomes. It's quite different to other types of ferns. Most ferns generally they form a rosette, and all the leaves come out of one central point and they form like a ring of leaves. Whereas with Davallia ferns, they tend to be creeping, and you can see here what they have is a long rhizome that creeps along the ground, and then every 2 or 3 centimeters, an inch or so, they send up a new leaf, and that's just how they grow. So this is growing on a lava rock. It's basically a porous stone, and it can suck up the moisture and it constantly stays damp. These ferns, where they grow naturally, they either grow on rock surfaces or they grow on bark of trees. So they're a type of epiphytic plant. So what they need is something that they can scramble over the surface of and get the roots into small crevices and just basically have constant moisture. So this rock gives it that constant moisture that it needs. What I do is I fill up the bottom here. There's a tray. I always keep that tray topped up with water. The stone then is constantly soaking wet because it's constantly sucking up the moisture, and that way the roots are always wet for this plant. But compared with some epiphytic plants, such as some of the orchids like the Phalaenopsis orchids, it's not too picky when it comes to soil type, so it can actually be grown in soil as well. But I quite like it here on a rock. It's quite different to compare with what most houseplants are grown as, and it just gives it a bit of more interest. So what I'll be doing in this video is I'll be trying to take a cutting. I'll have to probably do the update on the cutting in a few months' time because that will take a while. But I'll just give you a tour of the plant and show you how it's doing. So if I take some of the leaves away here so you can actually see, you can see the rhizomes have spread down quite nicely. And I'll just rotate it. This has been growing in the same position for about 6 months now. So all the leaves are facing one direction. So when I turn it, you should be able to see that. You can see they're all facing that one way. And it does tend to grow towards the light. On this side there is a lot of moss, so I might take some off, but I think what I'll do is I'll just rotate it round for another 6 months and then let all that moss die off, and then it should look like this side here where there's not any moss growing at all. You can see there's not any moss. There's also a lot less leaves because the leaves tend to grow towards the light, but the rhizomes they don't always seem to grow towards the light. They just kind of grow randomly. I think the rhizomes, to be honest, are more interested in the moisture. They seek out the damper conditions, and whereas the leaves are the ones that move around and search for the light. So for the first year of its life I had it in my flat in Edinburgh, and this was on a windowsill that was in the bathroom, so it was nice high humidity and it wasn't too cold either, but there was very little light because although it was on a windowsill, it was north facing and it was in the corner of a building, so they didn't get much light at all. And it grew slowly and it did quite well. It then lived for about 6 months in my parents' utility room where it was always about 10 or 12 degrees and it was a similar level of light. It was a north facing window. There it grew even less because this is a subtropical species. This one doesn't like very cold temperatures, but it can handle down to 5 degrees no problem, but it can't handle frost. So it didn't do too bad in that position. It didn't put on any strong growth, but the leaves didn't die off or anything, so it still looked quite happy. And then I brought it into my new house probably about 6 months ago now, and that's been growing in a much drier atmosphere. So if I turn this around, you might see some of the leaves are looking a little bit brown on the edges. That's because it's a bit dry in the house for it. I would like to have it in the bathroom, but it's actually got so big now that it's a bit too big for my bathroom. There's not any handy position for it, so it's currently growing inside the house. I might at some point put it into the conservatory. The conservatory is very high humidity and it should actually do quite well in the conservatory. It would just have to be in a slightly shadier position though, because this plant doesn't like direct sunshine, so if this was in a position with direct light it would do quite bad. But where it is at the moment, it's in a south facing room, so there's plenty of light, but it's just far enough away from the window so it doesn't get direct sunshine. And that's something it seems to really like, is bright light but never any direct sunlight. This can handle really quite dark shades, so if you have a very dark corner this would be quite a good plant for that. But if you want the most rapid growth, do give it a bit more light, somewhere indirect bright light, and it will do it its best. So as I say, it's getting quite big now. I'll probably need to start trimming this back a bit. These rhizomes, they can go quite far without being in soil because that they'll get their moisture from further back in the rhizome where it connects to the lava rock. So these will continue to spread and get too big, so I'll need to do a little bit of pruning. But before I prune it, I'd like to try propagating this plant so I can maybe grow it somewhere else. So I'm going to be doing that now. The rhizome I'm going to choose is this one down here. This is the largest rhizome that's escaping from the pot. And what I'm going to try is growing it in orchid mix. As I said before, it's not too fussy, but it is technically an epiphytic plant. So it would probably do best in a free draining mix, but being a fern, it doesn't mind its roots being wet, so it can grow in soil as well. I'm going to try it in orchid bark. I've got some old orchid bark here, and I got a nice shallow container. I couldn't put it in a deeper one because of how low this is. I'd have to prop this up higher up. So the way I'm going to propagate this, there's a couple of ways I could do it. I could cut this off and keep it in very high humidity, cut it off somewhere about here, so I've got a decent section of rhizome and one leaf, and just keep it in a high humidity environment, and this should slowly start growing roots. But there's a bit of risk that it might dry out and die before it grows roots. I would have to keep it very humid for it to be cut off completely. So I'm just doing a safer method, and that is just to put this in a container. So I'm going to be placing it roughly around about here, and I'm going to keep it in contact with this bark medium. I'm going to make sure this is always kept nice and damp, the bark. What that should do is the rhizomes should then detect the moisture, and it will start growing small roots and then become established inside this bark medium. Once I see that the roots are well established and it's starting to put out a second leaf, I'll then cut it back here, and it should be fully rooted in there, and I've got no risk of it dying off because its root system's already established before I cut it off from the original parent plant. So I'll have to kind of prop this up somewhere, and once I do that I won't be able to move the plant because it'll be very easy to disturb the roots. So I can't pot it up in this exact position because this isn't where the plant's going to stay, but it's going to be roughly like this with the rhizome just tucked inside, making sure that it's in contact with the bark at all times so that it can grow into there. So that's all for this update. It's just a very quick update to show you how my Davallia Fern has been doing. As I say, it's been growing quite well. It's quite an interesting fern. I find it quite interesting because of its creeping rhizomes that look a bit like furry animal legs, like, you know, a bit like a rabbit. I think one of the common names is a rabbit foot fern. So it's an interesting fern, and I'd like to see if I can get some more lava rock plants in the future. They do seem to do really well. This one, because it's a fern, it doesn't need much feeding at all. I feed about twice a year with a very dilute solution of houseplant feed, and then once or twice a year I also shower this as well. What can happen is when it's constantly pulling out moisture from the bottom, you can get salt building up on the top. You can see a bit of it starting already. So what I do is I just wash it off in the shower. The plant loves water anyway, so it quite likes to shower every now and again, and that washes all the salt away, and that just stops any salt build up, because salt will eventually kill the plant if it's allowed to build up. I think another reason it doesn't need feeding much is because a lot of tap water has nitrates that have leached into it from farming or from other sources, so it doesn't need much feed anyway, but tap water has a little bit of nitrates in it, so that's just enough to keep it going. And I just give it a little bit of feed twice over the summer just to make sure it's got that little bit of a boost. But one of the issues is if you do feed it too much, you'll get a lot of moss, and you'll get a lot of liverworts or algae starting to grow on the rock. You can see in this one it's mostly free on the back, and on the other side it's got a little bit of moss, but not too much. The first year I had this, I did feed it a bit more, and it did get very green. But you can see here there's not too much moss growing and not too much algae, so I've been keeping it quite underfed at the moment, and it's been doing well. So one interesting thing with this plant is it does seem to be slightly dependent on the weather outside, so it's not tropical, it's more subtropical. So although it doesn't have the cold frost where it comes from natively, it does have a cooler period, and in winter I find this loses about half of its leaves. It's winter at the moment, and it's lost about a third of them so far, so it was actually quite a bit leafier than this. It tends to lose about half its leaves, and then it regrows them in spring. But it never goes completely deciduous, at least not in the environment I've had it in. Maybe if you had it in a cold environment it would do. So that's about it for this video, and I'll give you guys an update probably in about 6 months' time when that cutting has rooted. I suspect it will be quite a slow process, as most ferns tend to grow quite slowly.